All right.
Hi, good morning. Welcome to this very diverse and exciting array of papers. I am going to be super minimalist with the introductions because you have some information about each of the presenters in the program. So we are going to go almost to the order listed in the program, beginning with Sonia Katyal, who is at Fordham Law, who will speak about the intellectual properties of gender. Then Nancy López, who is in the sociology department at the University of New Mexico. Colorblind and neoliberal racial projects in federal data collection, why we need 2 questions on Hispanic origin and race in the U.S. Census and beyond. Then Karen Gaffney, who is an English professor at Raritan Valley Community College in New Jersey. You and Sonia may tie for the farthest traveled award. Thank you for coming. Whiteness as trespassed property, uniting Cheryl Harris and Joyce Carol Oates in challenging the status quo. And then I am Lisa Pruitt from UC Davis, where I teach law, and my title is Reappraising the Value of Whiteness as Property, drawing lessons from Winter's Bone.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. So turning to my topic for today, the intellectual properties of gender. Let me just start off by just talking a little bit about sort of where this intersection comes from. So my general work divides into 2 main areas. One is on gender and sexuality, the other is on intellectual property and property. And so a few years ago, I started thinking about how these 2 areas were kind of intricately connected. And so I started thinking about how gender theory affects intellectual property. And so I wrote a piece about fan fiction and sexuality and copyright. And then this is kind of the part 2 of that original project. And it's sort of an attempt to kind of grapple with the reverse continuum. That is to study how our legal constructs of property theory can affect our thinking on sex and gender, encouraging us to sort of look at who gets excluded from these paradigms and to show how exploring these theories can actually lead, I think, to a more inclusive treatment of transgender individuals in the law. And to some extent, I think we see a lot of this transition in the United States, where for many years the law kind of treated transgender individuals as outsiders to the law, people who were sort of forced to live in their assigned sex at birth, irrespective of how they might have viewed themselves and their own sort of gender fluidity. And I think part of what also inspires us to kind of think about these constructs more critically is the fact that for many individuals, the constructs of sex and gender are becoming outdated. And so to shed some light on this movement, I thought it might be helpful to kind of turn to the language of property and intellectual property. And so the first part of this paper really attempts to explore how biological sex has been treated very similarly in the law as a type of property, a kind of tangible, fixed, almost immutable kind of truth. And so in the early 90s, as we all know, Cheryl sort of boldly and brilliantly offered the suggestion that whiteness constituted a property rather than identity alone. And she argued that whiteness has functioned as self-identity in the domain of the intrinsic, personal, and psychological. It's functioned as reputation in the interstices between internal and external identity, and it also functions as property in the extrinsic, public, and legal realms. And so what I argue is that much of this can also be said for biological sex. It's always presented in terms of polarities. Male and female constitute opposite ends on the spectrum of sex. Rarely do we conceive of sex as anything other than a series of these bipolar classifications, resistant to change and biologically determined. And yet at the same time, science teaches us that there's actually countless exceptions to this oppositional distinction between male and female. So like race, I argue that biological sex has moved from being a privileged identity to a vested sort of interest. It is both identity, status, and property at the same time. And the law constructs biological sex as a given fact when in reality it's much more complex and much more nuanced. It's much more like a sort of it functions as a sort of property right or an entitlement, which tends to actually disadvantage the interests of those who fall outside of its polarities. So if we look at the science of this, individual sex includes a variety of physical characteristics: external and internal reproductive anatomy, chromosomes, hormones, secondary sex characteristics, in addition to the person's gender identity. And so there are lots of exceptions to this presumption of sort of polarity that I write about. So for example, intersex individuals, who are generally defined to possess a variety of congenital conditions in which a person has neither the standard male nor the standard female anatomy. And turning to the law, we see as well this very powerful presumption of biological sex, which functions in a way as a sort of scarce resource, what I call the sexist scarcity model, a fixed, certain, seemingly immutable classification, a presumption that there's sort of only two polarities, and the law is attaching sort of a privileging to both. And the result of this presumption of scarcity has real-world effects, which means that countless individuals who have transitioned from the opposite sex have been excluded from legal protections. So if we look at the history of transgender individuals in the United States, within just a few years after the first inaugural clinic opened in the mid-60s, 10 others opened. But many of those clinics that were actually meant to sort of serve the needs of transgender individuals actually wound up relying on a model of transsexualism that was so narrowed that it risked excluding a variety of gender variant individuals. So as one scholar reports, to qualify for treatment, it was important that applicants report that their gender dysphoria is manifested at an early age, but they have a history of playing with dolls as a child, if born male, or trucks and guns, if born female, that their sexual attractions were exclusively to the same biological sex, that they have a history of failure at endeavors undertaken while in the original gender role, and that they pass or had the potential to pass successfully as a member of the desired sex. And as a result of this pathologizing tendency, many individuals were actually turned away for very spurious reasons, because they were too successful in their natal gender roles, because they were married, because they had read too much about transsexualism, because they had the wrong sexual orientation, because clinic staff didn't consider them to be sexually attractive in the cross-gender role, or because they wouldn't comply with the lifestyle requirements imposed on them by the clinics. Those that were accepted for treatment were pressured to often avoid socializing with other transsexuals on the grounds that they were, quote, now normal men and women. And early case law, in many ways, sort of reflected this kind of emphasis on a polarity. So in the 60s and 70s, there were cases that refused to allow individuals to change their birth certificates. In one 1974 case, the New York Superior Court addressed the issue of the validity of a marriage between a transgender man and a non-transgender woman, and the court annulled the marriage on the grounds that Mark does not, quote, does not have male sexual organs, does not possess a normal penis, and in fact does not have a penis, and the absence of male genitalia meant that Mark was not able to perform male functions in a marriage. And describing him, the court said, Mark is a male trapped in the body of a female. The record does not show that the entrapped male successfully escaped. So it's these notions of sort of scarcity and discrimination that were based on volitional choices that kind of informed the thinking, which created sort of this idea of sexist scarcity, but there were these polarities between male and female. And there are other sort of property-like notions in the law's treatment, the early treatment of trans individuals, the perception of staticity, absolute use and exclusion, the idea that you could only occupy the polarities of male and female at one time, very much in many ways functioning like the numerus clausus principle that we see in property, the idea that there are only a fixed number of categories and there's no deviation from them. And while the law has now advanced to protect individuals' changes on birth certificates and so on, it hasn't really advanced sufficiently to the point where discrimination against trans individuals is construed as discrimination on the basis of sex or even sexual orientation. Now, the second part of the paper turns to gender as opposed to sex and really grapples with a different notion of gender, as having particular characteristics that actually resemble intellectual properties as opposed to tangible properties. And part of this trend is sort of motivated by two major shifts. First, within the trans movement, the model shifted from a medicalized view of transsexuality, where you had to be diagnosed with a gender identity disorder, to a gradual trend towards building a greater community for transsexuals who had previously been really quite pressured to assimilate and not to self-identify as trans individuals. But by 1990, a whole variety of groups, cross-dressers and transsexuals, had begun to kind of question the appropriateness of the categories under which they were described. And this new sort of emergent model could be characterized as a much more nuanced and much more amorphous view of gender that would allow individuals to kind of structure their lives along a continuum of gender as opposed to a strict crossing from male to female or the reverse. And obviously at the center of this work is one of the most influential writers on gender, Judith Butler, who offers a view of gender as a performance. And actually in the law, we actually see a few cases that I think really do sort of indirectly take up Butler's focus on this idea of performance. And in some ways, the link between Judith Butler's work and Price Waterhouse is this normative suggestion that gender stereotyping is like imposing a sort of script onto a person, a script that is about a particular kind of performance, a particular kind of expectation that is linked to this idea of your assigned sex at birth. And I think about gender in this context as having some similar qualities of intellectual property. That is, that it's non-exclusive, that one can sort of mix and match aspects of masculinity and femininity at the same time. And in many ways, the courts have sort of started to kind of take up this view indirectly. So there's a case in 2000 that involved a trans woman who was attacked in a prison, and the court held that to demand a transgender person present herself to society in a way that matches the stereotypes associated with her birth assigned gender is gender stereotyping. So there are sort of moments where I think the law is recognizing the fluidity of gender. It's still not a universal recognition. So for example, it's often necessary for individuals to obtain the diagnosis of gender identity disorder in order to access the protections from sex discrimination. There are other issues that come up with respect to the protection of cross-dressing, which is largely considered to be a volitional choice, and also some of the issues that come up in institutional environments that are also sex segregated. And I think one of the big problems that we see is that the law really insufficiently takes into account the fact that there's a multiplicity of ways in which people transition. So some engage in genital surgery, some do not, some take hormones, some do not, and so how does the law really account for this kind of fluidity? And in the last section, just very quickly, I sort of turn to the normative question of how to construe this relationship between sex and gender, right? If we draw these parallels between property and intellectual property. And so here I rely on a lot of the discourses in cyberfeminism and really argues that we have to construe gender as a sort of commons, a public resource that is open to multiple possibilities of interpretation. So I argue here that the law should protect gender as a type of expressive performance and expression rather than as a fixed or discrete identity in order to encourage the protection of gender as a function of individual self-determination. And this strategy, I think, actually recognizes the pluralities of gender, the many different ways in which people express their gender identities. And so thinking about it through the lens of a commons is actually a really, I think, a very interesting way to kind of bypass the emphasis on polarity and instead think theoretically about the idea of gender as like a fluid kind of form of expression. And this isn't just like a theoretical exercise purely. It also has some doctrinal and statutory hooks. So if you look internationally throughout the world, there are countries that I think are doing some work that resembles this. So throughout South Asia, Australia, New Zealand, other places, there are actually third categories for individuals who are trans-identified. And while we can certainly critique some of those categories and the implications of those categories, it is true that they allow people to transgress the categories of male and female. And so what this does, I think, is imply the non-exclusivity of gender. It really embraces the non-rivalrous character of gender and allows for a much greater degree of sort of fluidity. And, and I think that we see this as happening, perhaps not in the law in the United States, which I think is trying to catch up to this, but even if we look at Facebook, which introduced 50 new gender categories for individuals, just this past year, we see a real recognition that this sort of change is possible. And not only is this kind of change possible, but it also, I think, more aptly tracks some of the identities that individuals adopt. And so in the end, I think by excavating the sort of codes and scripts of both biological sex and gender through the lens of property theory, just as Harris did, I think that we can come to understand descriptively how the themes of property, themes of scarcity, polarity, actually operate in the construction of gender between male and female, masculine and feminine. And I think we can also come to understand normatively how reframing gender through the lens of a public resource, a sort of intellectual commons, I think, enables greater fluidity and multiplicity regarding gender expression, allowing us to transcend the strictures of sex and gender in the process. And hopefully, I think, to address the importance of this new civil rights movement for the future. Thank you.
Right on time.
It should be on the bottom.
On the bottom, do you see?
The PowerPoint?
Oh, no, I don't see.
Okay.
Let me let you find it.
I don't know if this is right, but
Okay.
give it a shot.
So I'll just go ahead and start. I always start by saying Buenos dias, familia, so I can kind of highlight the idea that we're all family, right? So there's this myth that race is biological, but we know that through the human genome that we're all related. Despite what these exams of ancestry want to portray, it's only measuring how long ago your ancestors left from Africa. So the topic I want to talk to you about today is looking at federal data collection on race and ethnicity as a site of racial formation, and I'm going to argue that we do need two questions on Hispanic origin and race. And before I do that, I want to have you just self-reflect. What is race? What's ethnicity? Consider how your own embodied life experiences and cumulative life experiences with racialization and your academic training shape your understandings of these terms. And then the big question is, if we're interested in interrogating inequality, how should we capture race and ethnicity, especially for Hispanic communities for the 2020 census? Should we combine those two? So this quote comes from Moment. We're not going to read it, but it basically says, because there's such little understanding of what race and racism is, that's a major obstacle to remedying race and racism. And then I mentioned the institute that I started in 2009 with Laura Gomez, who's now here, called the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice, and that's the focus, really establishing empirical, methodological, and conceptual clarity about race. So the piece that really spoke to me, and I remember it was 95 when I actually read the Little Red Book, so that's the date that I'm going to quote. The story about the grandmothers really hit home for me, right? And this particular quote that says, in the burgeoning landscape of urban America, though anonymity was possible for blacks, and I put racially stigmatized person with white features, and this really spoke to both of my grandmothers. I'm Dominican. Both of my grandmothers are Dominican, born and raised in the Dominican Republic. One was often mistaken on the street for being Yiddish, or Hebrew, or Jewish, because she was blonde and blue-eyed and spoken to in Yiddish, and the other one was just black. And so that is the point that I want to make. What is your street race? If that is the objective, to really capture how people are racialized on the street when they go for looking for an apartment, we really need to think carefully about how race is conceptualized, and this is why we need two questions, especially for Latino communities, but for any community, mixed race or otherwise. So my point of departure is that is the reason we collect the data. It's for voting rights, education, employment, housing, criminal justice, any other social outcome, health. And that right now there's a fetish that we're just collecting this data on identities. It's never tied to social outcomes. So the argument really is building on what Ome and Wenat just finished doing on their third edition of Racial Formation in the United States, that race is a phenomic, ocular, and corporeal dimension of social status. It's a property that frames your access to a number of resources. And the term that I'm trying to coin is street race. It comes from many studies that talk about the importance of race as something that happens to people on the street, as a master social status. And that this is a site of racial formation. Federal racial and ethnic data collections is a site of racial formation, and I cite a couple of other things. And one of the questions I pose is who controls and manages, right, that property, that site of racial formation, the real estate on the questionnaire. So this is this is a slide that is too busy, but what I'm basically arguing is that even though it's well-intentioned, it's about, we want to capture the diversity of how people see themselves, that this has some unintended consequences. A proposal to combine the current format, which separates Hispanic origin from race, homogenizes Latinos, right, and negates the real history of the colonization of people of indigenous background and the enslavement of Africans. And that this measurement equivalence has many pitfalls. Even their own alternative questionnaire experiment in 2010 found that when you do that combined question, you lose detail on national origin and you have less race data. So what you find out is, yeah, I'm Hispanic. Well, I'm not going to tell you that I'm Mexican because I already told you I'm Hispanic. So it's interesting, their own data find that. What they did find was that less people checked some other race, but so what? That doesn't really matter. And I'll show you a chart that basically says some other race is an important category. It also rearticulates the ultimate purpose of the data collection, right? From civil rights monitoring and enforcement to the collection of identities or ideologies devoid of any link to civil rights outcomes. And it contributes to neoliberal and colorblind racial projects by having this discourse on real estate. How much real estate on the questionnaire are we going to use, right? We have to streamline, right? And so the other thing I want to flag is that some of the alternative questionnaire experiments that happened during the census data collection actually eliminated the word race, which was advertised and promoted by the American Anthropological Association in their memo to the Office of Management and Budget in 1998 that basically said, race is not biologically real, therefore what Kimberly Crenshaw calls the vulgar constructionism, it isn't real, right? We shouldn't collect any data. Let's just replace the word race with ethnicity. And that's basically where we're headed. In the Latin Americanization thesis, Bonilla and Glover also point to that direction. There's going to be less data. So this is all part of this neoliberal project. So I'm not going to go point by point, but what I'm trying to lay out is the different discourses and conceptualizations of race that stem from the neoliberal colorblind project and the racial justice project. So the neoliberal project assumes that race is voluntary and it's a decontextualized identity. It's just about individuals. We have to be fair and treat everyone equally, and there's really no interrogation of inequality or power. It's a market-based decision. It costs too much to have those two questions, and it denies, it really basically ignores institutional and structural discrimination. And there's this fetish of good intentions. A good intention is, well, most Hispanics don't like those, well, the truth is they come from countries where they're colorblind, right? So the fact that most Hispanics don't like, or a lot of them don't answer the race question the way the census wants them to, is not enough of a reason to eliminate or to conflate. So racial justice does see that race is a contextualized social status in a particular institutional arrangement. It focuses on oppression, and equal treatment doesn't mean equity. So a lot of the suggestions are, well, why do Hispanics have a different question, and it's because there's a very different history there, right? So the idea that everyone's just equal is a problem. It's about equitable treatment, right? The racial justice perspective would focus on race-sensitive social outcomes like education, employment, housing discrimination, and that the decision-making should be based on what is the value of this format versus that format in terms of interrogating inequalities. So they're two very different lenses. This is the chart that the census doesn't really, it's part of their materials, but they don't really talk about this when they're trying to promote the conflation of race and ethnicity. And the question I have to ask you is, in looking at the range of responses, how Latinos answered the race question when asked, what's your national origin, what is your race, is do they have the same experiences when they interact with police officers, all of these groups? Do they have the same experiences in the emergency room, when they're looking for an apartment, when they're going for employment? And none of the testing that's being done is looking at this. None of the focus groups that they're organizing are targeted towards, let's say, if you're a white Cuban versus a black Cuban, is there a reason why you check that? And even this some other race category could very well be capturing what most people would think of as people who are racialized as Hispanic. So the fact that some people are racialized as Hispanic doesn't mean that every single person who's Hispanic is racialized as Hispanic. And that is something that could be captured if we keep the two questions. I want to also point out the cost of not collecting good data. So I don't know how many of you saw this. The New York Times headline basically said it was reporting on this health affairs article that looked at life expectancy by race. And the one thing they reported is that life expectancy for whites did go down, for white women in particular, but among the least educated. However, the punchline of the article was that racial gaps in life expectancy are huge and they're increasing. And so what got reported was, oh, it's only white women who or the least educated whites whose life expectancy is shrinking. This was the most paradoxical report. It reports that Latinos have the highest life expectancy of any group in the country. But the question, and they actually acknowledged it, they said, but we don't have very good data because this is not accounting for the differences between immigrants and the second generation. We don't have subgroup data. And so when I look at that chart before, I'm thinking, do they all have the same life expectancy? I would doubt that, based on where they live, how they're racialized, etc. So that there's a real cost to not having good data, right? I show you this picture because it's the public housing project where I grew up in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where my mom actually still lives. And I think about, how this is why we collect the data. We're trying to understand. And another image I would have loved to have shown you is the co-op housing that is just a block away, which was not accessible to racial minorities for decades until there were lawsuits. And they were basically open to white immigrant, mostly Jewish immigrants. In fact, you still see that segregation is there. And think about the life expectancy in those two communities that were literally separated by one street, Delancey Street, if you know Manhattan. Anyway, so this study, which I'm sure you probably saw, it came out 2 years ago, was probably one of the most innovative studies, a federal housing audit study that basically found that there is some very little discrimination that's based on when you call and you sound Hispanic or your name is Asian or whatever, you most likely will be invited to come and see the apartment. But the discrimination happened when you showed up at the door and you were a visible minority, where you were told, no, there aren't any more units, or shown less than your white counterparts. And this was a huge study that was done. So again, another reason why we need to continue to capture street level race. This is the high school I went to, Washington Irving High School, and I tell all my students, I was born and raised in New York City. This was a regular high school in New York, 4,000 students, and the first time I sat in a classroom with a white student was when I started my first year at Columbia College in 1987. De facto segregation. 2 blocks away, Stuyvesant High School, almost entirely white. So thinking about race as multi-level is incredibly important, and to what degree do our measures capture that? So I'm not going to go into details on all of these studies, but there is plenty of evidence that if you are interested in interrogating inequality in all of these policy domains, you need to have those two questions for Hispanics and other groups, right? So I'll start concluding by saying, how will we know when we're successful? We will know that we're successful when people understand what the purpose of that data collection is, right? It's for monitoring civil rights. That Latinos in the same biological families will answer that question differently, the race question. They don't all occupy the same racial status, right? We need to make sure that people understand we're trying to capture your street level race, not just your identity, right? That could be captured in different ways. That we add generational status, where were your parents born, so we can discern the outcomes between immigrants and second generation. That we assess the utility of one format versus another in terms of whether or not that allows us to assess equity-based public policies. I have a proposal that we need these 4 questions, right, to keep what we have right now, which is Hispanic origin and race separate, that we treat the sum of the race as the de facto category for people who are racialized as Hispanic, and as I mentioned before, collecting the generational status, and then, you know, the issue of, well, we don't have detailed data on blacks or on whites. Okay, well, let's add ancestry or, you know, origin or whatever you want to call it. I'll just put in a plug for a book that Laura and I just completed. It was a co-edited volume of a National Institutes of Health workshop that we held that presents some conceptual models for race. This is mine. I'm not going to have time to go into it, but you can absolutely look that up in Mapping Race. And there's one that incorporates the measures of discrimination. And if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to send you the PowerPoint. Some of it is already on my website. So I look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Okay, great, welcome. So my paper is called Whiteness as Trespassed Property, Uniting Cheryl Harris and novelist Joyce Carol Oates in Challenging the Status Quo. In our respective educational backgrounds, our disciplines, the departments we teach in, all have boundaries that tend to keep critical race theory separate from English. So that means in our separate worlds, we have on the one hand, Cheryl Harris at a law school in the field of critical race theory, writing a law review article called Whiteness as Property about the way that whiteness is a tangible and intangible property. Then, far away in a separate world, we have Joyce Carol Oates in an English department in the field of creative writing and literary studies, writing a novel called Bellefleur about the Bellefleur family who establishes and defends their wealth. If we keep the boundary intact between these disciplines, the story ends there, and we will never see the possibilities that emerge from bringing them together. And that was the boundary I was up against more than 10 years ago when I was working on my PhD in English, writing a dissertation about the potential connections between critical race theorists and literary writers. The English department was not familiar with or even very interested in critical race theory, but they were not alone. Such a perception permeated the literary and humanities conferences where I presented my work. This culminated in an interdisciplinary humanities conference where I presented a paper called Critical Race Theorists as Storytellers, Why Aren't We Listening? And alas, very few people attended my presentation, and so my question echoed around a near empty room. Several years later, I am still trying to break down this boundary because I believe strongly that removing this boundary can reveal so much about, in this case, the social construction of whiteness, but more broadly, the way that systemic racism continues to permeate our society. Now more than ever, in the aftermath of Ferguson, and in a time when many believe our society to be post-racial, we need to bring together all of the scholars and activists who care about racial justice, regardless of discipline, and build interdisciplinary tools for fighting racism. So let's take away this border and see what happens. Okay. Harris provides an unprecedented analysis of what it means to say that whiteness is property by revealing the history and evolution of whiteness and its multiple manifestations, both tangible and intangible. Her analysis, in turn, helps us realize that the novel Bellefleur is not just about the family's wealth, but also their whiteness, especially what whiteness means at different historical moments. Furthermore, the supernatural elements of Oates' novel helps us take Harris even further by exploring how whiteness can be trespassed, haunted, the ultimate trespass, resisted, and even destroyed. I'll talk through some examples of that in a moment. But first, we need to see that the conversation that can emerge between Harris and Oates is not just about their content, it's also about their form. Let's go back to the border between Harris and Oates, but this time it's in the context of their respective genres. Yes, Cheryl Harris wrote a law review article and published it in the Harvard Law Review. Interestingly, though, she begins with a poem, something I'm not sure legal scholars necessarily pay that much attention to. Maybe, just guessing. Not only does she begin with a poem, but it's a poem she wrote herself about her own grandmother passing as white. Quote, "She walked into forbidden worlds, impaled on the weapon of her own pale skin. She was a sentinel at impromptu planning sessions of her own destruction." In just a few stark lines, this poem shows us that violence permeates her grandmother's experience of trespassing into whiteness as property. Then, in another world of literature, Joyce Carol Oates publishes a novel with a major publisher, but she includes this author's note, where she explicitly tells us she's going to defy narrative conventions. Quote, "This is a work of the imagination, and must obey with both humility and audacity imagination's laws, that time twists and coils, and is now obliterated, and then again powerfully present, that dialogue is in some cases buried in the narrative, and in others presented in a conventional manner, that the implausible is granted an authority and honored with a complexity usually reserved for realistic fiction the author has intended. Bellfleur is a region, a state of the soul, and it does exist, and there sacrosanct its laws are utterly logical." End quote. With the boundary between them still intact, Oates' experimental form would receive significant attention by literary scholars, and there would be a lot of questions about what that experimentation allows her to do that she couldn't do otherwise. But if we remove the boundary between Harris and Oates, the examination of Oates' experimental form can spread back to Harris. We can acknowledge the significance of Harris beginning her law review article with a personal story in the form of a poem, a doubly defying narrative act. They're both experimenting with form, even using radical form, that we can in turn connect back to their content, which is also radical in its investigation of whiteness. We can then see that both writers are carrying out the critical notion that radical content demands radical form. I'd like to now go into a little more detail about how the social construction of whiteness emerges when we bring Harris and Oates together. I want to be clear that I'm not applying Harris to Oates. That might be the assumption if we focus on the simplistic view of Harris as the theory and Oates as the thing to be analyzed, but it's so much more than that. They both help us see more in the other, and then in turn help us understand together even more fully the sheer power of white privilege and how justice ultimately depends on dismantling white privilege. You already know that Harris provides us with an analysis of the history of the creation of whiteness and its evolution in the U.S. with an emphasis on the role of the law. When we understand that, Oates' novel is even more meaningful because we can see that the family built its empire on the foundation of its whiteness. However, without Harris, this is not at all the focus of literary analysis of Oates' novel. While there are many scholarly examinations of this novel, none of them focus on the family's whiteness. When the novelist is white and the characters are white, there is still, in literary studies, even now, very little emphasis on the study of whiteness, even though race is a significant focus of attention when the novelist and characters are people of color. Whiteness is still invisible, and that's part of the problem I'm describing. This is just a microcosm of our larger society. Whiteness as a socially constructed race is still invisible, and therein lies its power. I'd like to now get into a little bit more detail about the connections between Oates and Harris. The novel Bellfleur basically tells the story of the rise and fall of the Bellfleur family in upstate New York. Please note that for clarity's sake, I will discuss the novel chronologically, but understand that the novel is not told chronologically, which goes back to Oates' experimental form. There are three primary family leaders at three different historical moments, which Harris helps us understand as three different moments in the history of whiteness. They are Jean-Pierre Belfleur, his grandson Raphael Belfleur, and Raphael's great-granddaughter Leah Belfleur. First, we have Jean-Pierre Belfleur, who starts to build the family empire in the late 1700s by buying up land that the government has taken from the Oneida Indians. Harris helps us understand how Native Americans were not perceived as having any right to their own land because the only true land possession could be done by European settlers and later white Americans. 2 generations later, in the mid to late 1800s, we have Jean-Pierre's grandson Raphael, who controls what has developed as the family's vast empire. Raphael represents another major phase that Harris describes in the history of whiteness, where whites vigilantly embrace a strict racial hierarchy and associate it with science, pseudoscience. I want to explore this in a little bit more detail. Here is one example, in Oates' words, of Raphael's racial hierarchy. Quote, "The Negroes were sons of Ham and accursed. They didn't feel pain or exhaustion or despair like the white race. Some stocks of men are clearly bred for labor in the fields and others for thinking," end quote. Harris helps us see the pervasive and powerful implications of Raphael's racial ideology. His worldview is not isolated or fringe. It is mainstream America in the mid to late 1800s. Harris says, quote, "The legal definition of race was the objective test propounded by racial theorists of the day who described race to be immutable, scientific, biologically determined, an unsullied fact of the blood rather than a volatile and violently imposed regime of racial hierarchy," end quote. Then Oates builds on this idea even more when Raphael mocks his abolitionist brother Arthur by allowing a group of runaway slaves to stay in the most opulent room in the mansion. After the group leaves, the family perceives the room as contaminated and even calls it the, quote, "room of contamination." Quote, "The room was not simply haunted, it was contaminated. To breathe its air was to risk madness and death," end quote. On the one level, the family perceives the room as contaminated with blackness. Quote, "It was aired and scrubbed and polished, and a number of its furnishings removed," end quote. On another level, though, Oates is showing us, with Harris's help, that the process of racialization, the process of creating and defending white privilege, is itself contaminating. This becomes even more clear when we see the experience of Samuel, Raphael's son. When Samuel was in the room, he, quote, "saw in the mirror a mist-shrouded group of people, all of them black, but not a slave." He says, quote, "But you have no right to be here," end quote. Even though the runaway slaves leave the family estate, they return through an ultimate trespassing of not only the family's actual property, but also its very whiteness by appearing in the mirror in this room, without being in the room itself, without being reflected. In the mirror, they are free and not slave. They defy the laws of physics and trespass, haunt, and resist the family's whiteness. Then Samuel disappears in the room forever, and Raphael loses his beloved son, perhaps as punishment for his obsession with maintaining the family's whiteness. Finally, Harris also helps us see that the novel depicts a more contemporary development in the evolution of whiteness after there has been a shift in, but not an end to, whiteness as property. This occurs when Leah Belfleur is running the family empire, a time when the family has lost some of its land and wealth, and Leah is desperately trying to reclaim it and rebuild the family empire. She says, quote, "We should regain all that land. Why, if you look at one of Raphael's old maps, it's enough to make you burst into tears what we've been cheated of. They want to take everything from us," end quote. Harris helps us see that after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, in order for white privilege to continue, there developed an assumption of white privilege. Quote, "After legalized segregation was overturned, whiteness as property evolved into a more modern form through the law's ratification of the settled expectations of relative white privilege as a legitimate and natural baseline," end quote. In addition, Harris also tells us that an important part of that shift is the rise of colorblindness, where racism is denied and there is no historical context. Quote, colorblindness is a form of race subordination in that it denies the historical context of white domination and black subordination, end quote. Oates takes this idea to a new level by not having historical references or context in the world of Leah Bellflour. For the older Bellflours, they were rooted in history. There was a date next to their name in the family tree. For Leah and her generation, though, there are no dates. And when there are random historical references, like the model of a certain car, they anachronistically contradict each other so that historical context is absent. Again, Oates defies the laws of physics when she removes time from Leah's narrative. This supernatural development shows us that Harris is ultimately revealing how the law itself is a fiction, though we take it for granted as neutral and objective. When the law is used to create a fiction like whiteness, then the law becomes fiction. And when Oates disrupts the laws of physics, she forces us to question the laws that create and uphold whiteness. Together, Oates and Harris show us that whiteness damages whites even if they don't know it. After all, whiteness confers privilege on someone for something that isn't real, that isn't about that individual at all, but ultimately about a system of power and oppression that divides and conquers, that maintains the status of the elite. We witness Bellflours in pain. The more they are obsessed with family wealth and prosperity, and I would argue their whiteness, the more miserable they are. The family talks a lot about a family curse, and it manifests itself in supernatural occurrences, significant fluctuations in mood, and more. Their references to the Bellflour curse, I believe, are Oates' way of showing us that whiteness itself is a curse. The Bellflours who are happy are the ones who repudiate the family name, who move out of the mansion, which is ultimately destroyed, along with the Bellflours who are obsessed with their wealth and whiteness. Oates shows us that whiteness is not monolithic, that it is not natural. If it were natural, there wouldn't need to be constant negotiations about its borders. Finally, whiteness is an invention. It's a fiction. White skin by itself doesn't mean anything. It was imbued with meaning through systems perceived as neutral, but actually hierarchical. There's nothing inherent, natural, or biological about whiteness. If we created it, we can uncreate it. We need to make whiteness visible by making the systems, the laws, and its power structures visible. Oates and Harris lead the way by drawing attention to form, preventing structure from remaining invisible. They tell us the story of America that does not often get told, the narrative that says the story of America is the story of whiteness. This is what we can take away from interdisciplinary dialogue between Harris and Oates, a dialogue we need to encourage by breaking down boundaries, a dialogue we need to listen to because the time has come. Thank you.
If you were wanting to take a picture of the panel, is that what you were trying to do, or did it matter?
It doesn't matter.
All right, what a fabulously creative panel. I am so delighted to be part of it, and you know, just as a subset of this fabulously creative conference. And almost everyone who has spoken in the plenaries has, you know, prefaced his or her comments with, you know, their intellectual debt, if you will, to Cheryl Harris. And so I feel like I want to start at that point as well, and say that when I first read Whiteness as Property, which was only about a year ago, in the midst of a sabbatical where I had undertaken to to try to think about the white working class and poor whites as a race project. It was very eye-opening for me, and because I had read so much other critical race literature before I got to it, it wasn't. It was perhaps not as revelatory as it would have been if, like, most law students, it was sort of the first piece of critical race theory I had written. So I want to be explicit about the intellectual debt that I too owe to Cheryl Harris, even as as part of my larger project to think about poor and working class whites in a more nuanced way, my project to complicate whiteness, I push back at some CRT principles, if you will, or some CRT themes. So I have called my talk Reappraising the Value of Whiteness as Property, Lessons from Winter's Bone. So I'm acknowledging, right, whiteness as property, but challenging us to think quite specifically about the value of that property at different places and different times, to put it in historical and spatial context. All right, so I'm going to start with some preliminary observations about CRT from the perspective of someone who, again, whose sort of bigger project is to complicate whiteness. And so the views that I see are of whiteness as monolithic and as not particularly nuanced or complicated, as a sort of foil, right, for the analysis of minority groups. Another view is, in particular, a focus on poor and working class whites as being particularly problematic because, as Marnie Mahoney wrote in a journal article, they are sort of seen as the carriers, right, of racism. Generally, we, liberal elite types, right, are not as likely to point our fingers at affluent whites. And it's very easy, in fact, for affluent whites to fess up to their white privilege. And so in a way, we hold poor and working class whites, I think, to a different standard, and we place more blame on them. And, there's anger, there's resentment at this group who, among whites, arguably have the least power. We talk about whether they've been duped, right, by affluent whites into aligning themselves with whites, or whether, so are they really stupid, or are they sort of, actively to blame, because of racial animus. And again, so we seem sort of less annoyed, right, at affluent whites who are far more likely to, like me, right, fess up to our white privilege. And so maybe that's all that's really expected of affluent whites. So the other thing we see in CRT is, this assertion that it's always better to be white than to be black. So the hierarchy, the focus on racial hierarchy, and it's typically in a very broad brush way. And so Cheryl Harris, in a footnote, right, recounts the visit, and then someone yesterday recounted the sort of more contemporary, Chris Rock joke about, even the one-armed busboy who's white wouldn't change places with me, and I'm rich. So white people would never, ever, ever want to be black. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about whiteness, we talk about white privilege? I hear, different terminology. I'm asserting, right, that I see the concept of whiteness as really an abstraction, even though one of the claims of Harris, right, is that whiteness got reified as property. Yet in our discourse, we are often not talking about white people. We're talking about, structures, systems, right? It's really an abstraction. So we talk about white people, sometimes, not so much in CRT. We talk about whiteness. We talk about white privilege, and then occasionally, at least in my experience, less often we hear people talking about white skin privilege. So are we hinging the privilege to skin color, or are we connecting it to something else? So Harris obviously says, takes us from color to race to status to property, rooted in that racial hierarchy. It seems to me that from this rhetoric, whiteness is then sometimes depicted as the magic bullet, right? We sometimes see CRT scholars, but rarely explicitly say, whiteness isn't a magic bullet, but there's all this rhetoric that suggests that whiteness is in fact incredibly powerful. So I remember it's really only about 5-6 years ago, a student said to me, a student of color said something about white people's problems, and I heard the expression for the first time, "You're white, you'll be all right." And where I come from, because I grew up in an all-white, persistent poverty county in the Arkansas Ozarks. I know I come from poor white people. And so I was like, wait, where I'm from, food insecurity, homelessness, crappy educational opportunities, those are white people's problems as well as black people's problems. So it seems it's very difficult to conceptualize of white people as victims of racial discrimination, but I'm going to suggest that they can be victims of discrimination, and whether or not we call it racial discrimination, is open to debate. Whiteness, in short, gets collapsed into affluence. In response to a question that I asked yesterday, I was admonished not to frame class in white bodies, but I think what I tend to see is that we have collapsed minority status or minority groups. I don't like to use people of color because I think whites have color too, so I'm avoiding that term. I think we collapse socioeconomic disadvantage into racial and ethnic disadvantage, and so that means that whiteness is equated to affluence. And so that leaves us not seeing the struggles of poor and working class whites, which again is sort of part of my bigger project. How do we start to see and be constructive about in relation to poor and working class whites? Russell Robinson yesterday showed a music video of the song Black by The Dream, and the last slide of text was, "Black is a feeling and place from which one feels isolated by the world of the governing elite." And he said, he seemed sympathetic, right, to this argument, right? And he said, look at all the people in the video that's titled Black. The Occupy Wall Street movement, people from Ukraine, lots of people who are just getting a lot of crap all around the world, right? People at the bottom. And he said, so does this mean, everyone is black now? And really what I'm suggesting is, as Guinier and Torres, right, did not so long ago, that in fact poor whites can and should be seen as functionally black, and they should become the allies. That's really my bigger project, is how do we, I can read whiteness as property as a white class migrant and get it, but what should be our message to poor and working class whites? So lots of focus on the psychological benefits of whiteness, obviously in CRT, and so I've been trying to think about that and break it down. So here's some quotes from Whiteness as Property. All whites can include themselves in the dominant circle, although most whites hold no real power, often claim their privileged racial identity. Quoting Crenshaw, through the concept of whiteness, class consciousness among white workers is subordinated and attention is diverted from class oppression. Absolutely. So how do we counter that? Harris writes, through their whiteness, white workers are afforded access to a host of public, private, and psychological benefits. And so my question is exactly, what are these benefits? We have, we have empirical information now that tells us that poor and working class whites, when they get to college, suffer the same sort of stereotype threat, right? The same sorts of struggles that people of color. And yet that information is sort of not widely acknowledged, if at all, in CRT. So I'm a big fan of Camille Vera-Rich's 2010 article, Marginal Whiteness. She says, when scholars talk about white privilege in the abstract, without discussing the host of competing identity variables that complicate white privilege, they risk increasing the salience of whiteness for less race-identified whites in a context that gives whites an incentive to cling to a white identity. But if you look at who's citing marginal whiteness and the propositions for which they're citing it, this proposition is not getting a lot of buy-in. So let me show you, let me now turn, belatedly, to Winter's Bone to illustrate some of these principles, some of these ideas. Let's see, here we go. How many of you have seen the movie Winter's Bone? Great.
Way down in Missouri where I heard this melody, the old folks were humming, the banjos were strumming, so sweet and low.
Mike Satterfield, A1 Bonds.
What is it you want?
We hold the bond on Jessup Dolly. He didn't show for court.
That ain't no run.
Jessup signed over everything. Now, if he doesn't show a trial, see, the way the deal works is, y'all gonna lose his house here. You got some place to go?
I'll find him.
Girl, I've been looking.
I said I'll find him. You see, the law was out here hunting Jessup. Do you know where he's at? I wouldn't tell him nothing if I did. I really gotta run Dad down to get him to show.
You ought not do that.
Dad's your only brother.
I don't know where he's at, and I ain't gonna go around asking after him neither.
Who might you be? I'm Reed. My dad's Jessup Dolly. You ain't here for trouble, are you? I got a real bad need to talk to him. Talking just cause as witnesses. How long before we get kicked off our own property?
I reckon y'all got this place by the nose.
The law found Jessup's card. Somebody set fire to it. He wasn't in it.
You know there's people go around saying you best shut up? People you want to listen to.
Get out of the truck, put your hands where I can see them.
Is this gonna be our time?
There's stuff that you're gonna have to get over being scared of. Get off! Go to my sister! Get out!
You was warned, and you wouldn't listen.
Why didn't you listen?
So, as those of you who've seen the film will know, Reed Dolly, 17 years old, sets off to find her father dead or alive because the home, the very modest home that they live in the Missouri Ozarks, and the so-called timber acres will be lost because Jessup put them up when he posted bond. And so here's some other scenes from the film. Jessup's brother, her uncle, and the siblings that she is taking care of because the mother is basically mentally ill. So all of this weight falls on Reed Dolly, and this is all taking place in the midst of basically Missouri meth land, rural meth land. And it's a wonderful movie, won awards, you should see it. But what I want to use the movie to illustrate is the variability, right, in the value of whiteness as property. As someone who grew up in the same region, maybe 30 miles on basically the Arkansas side of the line, I thought it was so interesting that people commenting in the New York Times were so skeptical about the reality. And it was the people from Southwest Missouri who were saying, no, they're not making this up, right? People live like this. Not everybody in the region lives like this, but this stratum exists. And I'm going to suggest that we might think of the whole Dolly clan as sort of quintessential white trash. And I use that term advisedly. So let me tell you a little bit more about the place. The most salubrious place you ever see in the film is Forsyth High School. And you see Ree there talking, for example, to an ROTC recruiter. Her plan before Jessup goes missing is she's going to join the military, right? Which is what a lot of poor rural kids do, just like it's what a lot of urban black and brown kids do. So this is a rural place. It's 98.6% white. Taney County itself is not a persistent poverty county, but it's in the midst of a cluster of persistent poverty counties. A persistent poverty county is a county that has been high poverty, had a rate of poverty more than 20% for at least 4 decennial censuses. And so I wrote some blog posts about how Winter's Bone illustrates the limits of white privilege when the movie came out, and I just, it's just as well for me to read this. When you get down to a certain socioeconomic stratum, there is precious little privilege or material benefit associated with being white, particularly in an all-white community. Another way of stating this is that disadvantages associated with class, so the local bias, right, against white trash, and geography, a scarcity of jobs and opportunities that exists in rural Americas, just like it exists in many communities, black and brown communities in cities, seriously undermine the white privilege that Ree might enjoy in other settings. So just because I'm a geographer, right? So this is a persistent poverty map, and Taney County is right in there in the midst of that loop of persistent poverty counties. So we can analogize the setting that Ree and her family are in, right? Meth in rural America to crack and the heightened penalties that are associated with both drugs, the lack of economic opportunity for the uneducated, the culture of crime, that again we tend to associate with urban places, disadvantaged urban places, but also exist in all white communities in rural places. I was very struck by Nancy putting up the quote from Cheryl Harris. It wasn't a quote that I had fixed on before, right, about the anonymity associated with the urban that permitted Alma to pass. And this is not something, right, that happens in the context of the lack of anonymity that marks rural communities. So Ree and her family are white, yes, but they're also just the usual suspects because they are known basically to be a crime family. So again, the reputation, going back to some of the quotes you saw earlier, her reputation is just as a member of a crime family as one of the usual suspects. But, right, she has a home, she has the timber acres because she's white. So here's a place where we can clearly say Ree's family has some assets, and those assets, those material assets are linked to her whiteness. But how valuable is this land? I don't know. I mean, you saw how crappy the house was. I don't know how many timber acres the family has that they're trying to save, but I do know that the cost of an undeveloped piece of land in that area is about $1,000 an acre. So let's take Ree out of that Taney County setting for a moment. What if she went to the nearest university? What if she went to Missouri State in nearby Springfield? Well, unless she somehow has the cultural capital and the money, right? She's going to have to borrow some money to wear the right clothes if she's going to effectively class pass. Otherwise, she's going to be marked as white trash in that setting as well. What if she, so, is her whiteness doing her a lot of good here? Some good, yes, because that's going to be at least a somewhat limited mixed race place. but what if Ree is a real genius and she wants to apply to an elite college and university? Let's assume she's got a perfect SAT score and a 4.0, but there are no AP classes at Forsyth. And so what's she going to look like? Well, the most recent comprehensive study that we have of elite college admissions says that people like Ree, even if they have amazing numbers, don't get into elite colleges because they're not valued and they're not understood. Their credentials are not really cognizable. For example, Espenshot and Radford found that if you're a member of something like high school ROTC, the Future Business Leaders of America, 4-H, or the Future Farmers of America, it actually hurts your admissions prospects in relation to other types of applicants. So I just want to close, and I'm sorry, I know I'm trespassing on the time constraints here, with a few more thoughts about the concept of white trash in relation to whiteness as property. So Cheryl Harris says, right, whiteness and property share a common premise, a conceptual nucleus of a right to exclude. And Fran, this quote I have from Fran Ansley, I'm going to skip in the interest of time, but it basically just supports the idea, right, that whiteness is about systems and structures and not just, literally about white skin. Well, Matt Ray is the preeminent authority on white trash, and his most recent book, he's written several, or participated in several about the concept of white trash. His most recent is Not Quite White, White Trash and the Boundaries of Whiteness, and I put in all caps boundaries, because he talks a lot about boundary theory in the book. And here's maybe a representative helpful quote. The idea that whiteness is about race is simply not adequate to account for the case of poor white trash, a boundary term that speaks equivocally and ambivalently to the question of belonging and membership in the category white, and one that mobilizes a wide array of social differences to do so. And he goes through 4 periods of looking at the evolution of white trash, including, for example, the eugenics campaign, just think Buck versus Bell, and the campaign for hookworm eradication, because at one point the white trash were associated with being literally physically, like genetically different, that this is why they were so really irredeemable. And Bell Hooks says, right, privileged class Southern white folks sometimes saw white trash as more disgusting than black folks. So again, I guess that's a good place to end, going back to that slide or that video that Russell Robinson showed yesterday, the last 3 screens of the music video. Black isn't just a color, black isn't just a race, it's a feeling and place from which one feels isolated by the world of the governing elite. And I submit to you that you don't even have to go as low, if you will, to the Reed Dollies of the world to identify and see marginal whites, right, who are definitely not part of the governing elite, and that we need to find ways to translate the brilliance of whiteness as property to engage and have conversations and cultivate alliances in ways that I don't see a lot of effort, but maybe there are efforts of which I am not aware. So thank you all very much. All right, I guess now I'm the moderator. So we can push it on Q&A. We have 10 minutes till the session is supposed to end, but most sessions haven't been ending on time. So questions? Yeah, Nancy?
I really appreciated your presentation. I think this calls for the need for intersectionality research. So at the University of New Mexico, when we compare Pell eligible students, right, people who are qualifying are in the low income group, there is still a race gap in graduation rates. So that every single group of color has a lower graduation than white students. So I think one of the important things to remember is that when we're collecting this data, we always have to tie it to social outcomes. So what does that imply about how race is measured? So when we think about race, we always think of it as a micro level variable, individual level variable. Seldom do we incorporate meso measures like you saw in my high school and what that looked like versus, what a poor rural white high school might look like. all of those measures should be captured. The same is true at the high income group. So for students who have family household incomes of 78,000 or larger, there's still a race gap. So this is why intersectional work needs to be done, and data that captures race as more than just an individual level identity, that actually looks at things like school segregation, housing segregation, and then wealth measures are incredibly important, because you might have, and I know you know Black Wealth, White Wealth by Oliver and Shapiro, two families with the same income, but because of the history of white supremacy in this country, they will have different wealth. So you mentioned the land ownership. So it might be true that the few blacks that were there may have no land, right? So the wealth levels are very different. Right. So I think that that's why intersectionality is one of the things that we need in order to analyze this. But I do take your point about the alliances, the potential alliances that could be made to transform those schools, to transform those communities as something that we can work towards.
Yeah, Karen?
Yeah, and I'll just add that I certainly agree with that, and I think that there's so many connections between the kind of work that we've just talked about, but then also the conference overall. And I'll just mention that some of the work that I'm doing, both in my new blog and a book project I'm working on, is about trying to identify ways in which we're divided. And so I'm actually looking at three specific stereotypes that I see as divide and conquer stereotypes, and one of them is the stereotype of poor whites as redneck or white trash, Asian Americans as the model minority, and Latinos as illegals. And I'm actually doing a lot with the Census, and so I really found your work fascinating. And so it seems to me that these are three stereotypes that never really get connected together, but I see them as sort of operating on a race and class axis in similar ways, and that they're all being used to split people up.
Right.
And keep them separated so that they don't form alliances, so that the status quo continues to be perpetuated.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the first presentation and trace it back to through the presentation. As I was listening, I just found such interesting continuities. So when Professor Katyal spoke about the possibilities of third gender in parts of the world as South Asia, and immediately after that the continuity with Census, I was thinking ways in which some of those genders are then constructed through Census questions, and ways in which it is actually very difficult to do. So I was thinking, is that then construction of more gender identities? So, to think of the proposition that there is the possibility of more than two genders, and if there is that possibility, is that possibility construction of properties? And what does that take? But that's a larger or overarching question to ask. If I only just bring it down narrowly to Census as a way in which it is practiced and implemented, it is a very, very enormous exercise. So 2011 was the first time when India even started to count transgenders for the first time. And for a couple of years after, we weren't sure how that exercise went about. And yet, at the end of it, there was a figure that was declared as 500,000 transgenders in India. What that meant was that they had only taken out a number from male figures, which meant that they had not counted female to male transgender persons. So even just in making an attempt towards that third gender transgender category and applying that to Census figures, it wasn't an exercise that was implemented to any success, and we are left with a number which is open to so much critique. So and then we come to you in which there was unconstruction. So there was construction, and there was the difficulty of capturing these two senses, and then there was the unconstruction that let's just undo this, let's unconstruct whiteness. And so this is more as a way of just reflection of less as a question, but I don't know if I got this right in this way, and I don't know if in conceiving of this panel, this is how it was intended to be.
Yes.
That just makes me think
Oh,
of
I'm sorry.
street gender.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's good. That's right.
Totally. Yeah.
Did you want to respond, Sonia, or should we
No,
take another?
I just really appreciated what you just said.
Yes.
So I really wonderful what you did, and I really appreciate the focus on both gender and class as well as race. I think those intersections are really important. Sonia, you said, you argued that we should reimagine gender as commons. And I think that's a really fascinating idea, but it makes me think that we're up against an entire economic model of capitalism that formulates bodies as commodities. And so I guess my question is, when our economic system, inscribed in law, shows bodies as commodities, how do we get there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the way that I think about property and gender in this context is really by thinking about it more as an intellectual property, so more expressive and more performative than the sort of tangible notion that we attach with property per se, which I think very much kind of subtly informs our model of polarities between male and female. I think the question about how to execute the notion of a commons is a great one, particularly in a world where we do live in this capitalist society. And I think one of the big themes, right, about the 20-year reappraisal of that article really is about the way that commodity has played this incredible role in the construction of race and the construction of gender and the construction of class. Like, I think it's fascinating. I guess I just tend to think about the notion of a commons more, I don't want to say that I divorce it from those proprietary constraints, but I like to think of it more as along the spectrum of more expressive as opposed to proprietary. So that is opening up legal spaces for people to kind of play with the gender scripts. Whether or not they choose to commodify those, I think is a separate question, but really ensuring that the law doesn't indirectly or directly impose those scripts on individuals is sort of the way that I view the role of a commons. But it is a very theoretical move, and I'm not wedded to the idea of figuring out how it meshes or challenges the notion of capitalism. I think it actually, in some ways, just is, I guess I see it as sort of indirectly related, but not a clear obstacle when we think about it through the lens of expression. Certainly if we think about it through the lens of other things, I think you're entirely right, though. But that's a great question.
And as a follow-up, it sort of makes me think of what Lisa was saying about an impediment to coalitions. And I think it's something that there's not, I haven't really loved to, one of the things I haven't heard a lot about during conferences, sort of more sort of Marxist-style critiques of late capitalism, connections to Occupy, because these are the kind of things that sort of, I think, would get at these issues of class and gender as well.
Yeah.
Why aren't we doing more of that challenging the economic model, the economic monoculture in which we live sort of seeps into everything, and it's impacting the law as well as understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I do tend to think of Occupy as a world where I think there was, it was something that didn't really make it into the press as much as it did in just your experience of Occupy. But there was a huge amount of gender fluidity in terms of how people identified and how they expressed themselves. And that was also, I think, part of the discourse surrounding Occupy, was this notion of kind of occupying gender as well, right? I think what's so interesting, though, about what you're saying is that, and I don't mean to directly push back on what you're saying, but one thing that I do think is really interesting is that the capitalist market is actually leading us to a place where there is a recognition of gender fluidity. So Facebook making the decision to offer 50 different gender options is not only, I think, somewhat revolutionary for Facebook to do, but it's also very, very indicative of the way that the market is shifting, right? So I think that these two things can actually happen on parallel tracks, and then hopefully come to some synergy between them. And I would want to embrace what Facebook is doing and not lose the critique that you're offering, right? Just as much as I would want us to embrace the critique that you're offering, recognizing that that critique, just as you say, is totally devoid of that kind of gender fluidity. So that would be how I would respond.
And I don't know if you're LA based, if you're West Coast based.
East Coast, yeah.
Oh, too bad, because we're having class crits at UC Davis, November 14th and 15th. So if you can come back to the West Coast, please come. There will be some of that, right? I mean, class crits has become many things, but there is at least some, Marxism and major critiques of neoliberalism there, among lots of other things. I wanted to just follow up on, the idea of street race, which I too just love, right? And so I was naturally thinking of the street race or the rural road race, right? Of Reed Dolly. And so you obviously are focusing on the census, which is so important. But did you know that LSAC, the Law School Admissions Council, right, they have this very nuanced, like 50 different racial categories, but they collect no information on the socioeconomic status of family of origin, right? And so we all know, right, that whatever your color, if you're getting into elite education these days, the chances of you being socioeconomically deprived are less and less, and that we're diverting more and more of our financial aid resources from need-based aid to so-called merit-based aid. And of course the merit-based aid simply benefits those who look meritorious because they've had so many advantages through their youth and their families of origin. Yes.
So I was just going to add, I was on a panel at UNM called Exclusion Masquerading as Excellence that made that very critique, the idea of merit-based aid. And I was recently at Columbia College, which is where I did my undergraduate degree, and that question was asked, well, how do you consider your SAT scores? And they said, we have recruiters in every part of the country that know who's in the rural school, and so we do not have a cutoff. And they do, and I remember when I applied, this was 1987, they asked your parents' educational attainment and your occupation. So they prided themselves on having more than 50% of their students on financial aid. And 50% of the students are not of color.
Right.
So there are plenty of white kids who are going there also on, so it depends.
Is this Columbia? Did you say Columbia College?
Mm-hmm. So you can, I know for a fact that was the case in the 80s, but I was happy to see that was still happening.
Right.
So that there are nuances. And we just started a consortium on data policy in the state of New Mexico, where we are going to collect parental educational attainment.
Great.
And I think that if we don't have that, we cannot do justice for equity-based access to higher ed.
Right. But I wonder the extent to which, in this changed, economic environment, that schools are doing less. I mean, the studies I've seen shows that schools are doing less. And Richard Perez-Peña's, front page headline in the New York Times last month, a generation later, poor, still absent or lagged, in elite colleges. So I'm afraid the trend is moving in the wrong direction, but there's no doubt that there are colleges, Amherst is one that always gets mentioned, right, that definitely got their eye on this issue. I'm afraid that's just, we can't really say it's the trend anymore, but there are certainly some outliers, and thank heavens for them. All right, we can stay and chat or get ready for the next plenary.
I was going to mention, I put out some information on the Afro-Latino Forum. There's going to be a conference in 3 weeks on the 23rd in New York. So if anyone wants to grab it.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.